The morning my father-in-law told me I had no place in his family, it was raining. Not a dramatic storm, just a gray, flat Oregon drizzle that made everything look like it was slowly dissolving. I remember staring at the water running down the kitchen window while he spoke, thinking how strange it was that the world outside looked so ordinary when everything inside was ending. My husband Thomas had been gone for 11 days. 11 days since the call from Providence Memorial. 11 days since I'd sat in a hallway that smelled like antiseptic and bad coffee while a doctor explained that the accident on I-205 had been unsurvivable. 11 days since my mother-in-law Marguerite had looked at me across a hospital waiting room and said, without blinking, "You were barely married 2 years. You don't know what grief is." I was 26 years old, 8 weeks pregnant, and I hadn't told anyone yet. I was going to tell Thomas the weekend he died. I had the test in my purse the day of the accident. I'd been carrying it around for 4 days trying to figure out the right moment, the right way to say it. We talked about having kids someday, always in that comfortable, vague way young couples do. Someday, when we're ready, when things settle down. I thought he'd be nervous first and then happy. I thought we'd order takeout and stay up too late making plans. I never got to find out if I was right. So, when my father-in-law Gordon sat down at the kitchen table, Thomas's childhood kitchen, where I'd had Thanksgiving dinner twice and felt like I was still auditioning for a role I hadn't been given yet, I was already running on nothing. No sleep. No food I could keep down. No one in the world who knew there was a baby coming. He was a methodical man. He worked in commercial real estate and he approached every conversation like a negotiation, laying out his points in order, watching your face for leverage. He'd never been unkind to me exactly. He'd just never been warm. He said Thomas had updated his will shortly after the wedding, leaving the house, a small craftsman bungalow in northeast Portland that his parents had helped with the down payment on, to me. Gordon didn't believe that was Thomas's full intention. He said Thomas had been young and hadn't understood what he was doing. He said the family needed to grieve without complications. He said very carefully that he thought it would be best if I returned the house to the estate, found my own place to live, and gave the family some space. He called it space. I asked him what that meant, practically speaking. He said he thought I should be moved out within the month. I sat there for a long moment. The rain kept going. Someone had left a coffee mug on the counter that still had Thomas's name on it in permanent marker, a thing he'd done in college to keep track of his mug in a shared house and never stopped doing. I stared at his handwriting and I thought, with a clarity that surprised me, if I cry right now, he wins. I didn't cry. I said, "I'll need to speak with a lawyer." Gordon nodded like I'd said something reasonable, like it was all very civilized. Marguerite didn't come downstairs while I was there. I heard her moving around above us the whole time. I called my mother that night from the car, parked outside a Safeway because I couldn't face going back into the house yet. She was in Phoenix with her boyfriend, working at a dental office, living a life that had mostly moved on from the years when she'd been the person I called first. We weren't estranged. We just weren't close in the way I'd needed us to be right then. She listened. She said, "Oh, honey." She said Gordon sounded awful. She said she didn't have room at her place, but she could help me with first and last month's rent somewhere. I told her I was pregnant. There was a pause. She said, Oh, sweetheart." That was the whole conversation mostly. She meant well. I knew she meant well. I sat in that parking lot for another hour. A woman came out of the Safeway with 2 bags of groceries and a toddler balanced on her hip, doing 4 things at once with the competence of someone who had had to figure it out the hard way. I watched her get the kid buckled into a car seat, bags in the trunk, and drive away like it was nothing, like it was just Tuesday. I thought, I have to become that woman, not her specifically, but that, whatever it was. That ability to carry things and keep moving. I went back into the house. I ate crackers and ginger ale sitting on the bathroom floor because the first trimester was already making itself known, and I made a list. On a notepad, Thomas had bought at Powell's, one of those clever ones with a literary quote on the front that he bought because he thought it was funny. I made a list of every single thing I needed to figure out. It was a long list. I started at the top. A lawyer named Dennis, who advertised on bus benches and turned out to be genuinely good at his job, reviewed Thomas's will and told me the house was mine, legally, without question. Gordon could contest it, but he wouldn't win. I asked Dennis what it would cost me to fight it if they pushed. He gave me a number. I asked him what it would cost them. He gave me a higher number and said most people didn't like throwing good money after bad. Gordon and Marguerite didn't contest the will. They also didn't speak to me again. I sold the Portland house 8 months later. Not because I was forced to, but because I couldn't afford the mortgage alone, and I couldn't afford to live in a place where every cabinet I opened was full of someone I'd lost. I used the equity to pay off my student loans, which had been quietly suffocating me since graduation, and to start over somewhere new. I moved to Seattle with a 7-week-old daughter, a used Subaru, and enough money in savings to last 6 months if I was careful. I named her Josephine after Thomas's grandmother, who had been the one person on his side of the family who'd squeezed my hand at the funeral and said, "You're going to be all right, sweetheart. I know you don't believe me yet." I called her Josie. Seattle was hard in the way that starting over is always hard. Not dramatic, just relentless. The particular exhaustion of doing everything yourself with a baby who doesn't understand why you can't always pick her up the second she cries, because you're on a work call, because you're paying the electric bill, because you are the only person in this apartment and there is no backup. I'd studied finance at the University of Oregon. I'd been working at a mid-size investment firm in Portland when Thomas died junior enough that maternity leave wasn't going to save my job if I relocated, so I started from scratch. I did contract accounting work from my apartment while Josie slept. I applied to every firm in Seattle that had an opening and was honest with every single one of them. I'm a single mother, I'm reliable, I will outwork anyone you've ever hired. Some of them didn't call back. One of them did, a woman named Patricia Huang. No, wait, I need to check my list. A woman named Catherine ran a boutique financial consulting firm in Belltown and called me back on a Thursday afternoon while Josie was napping and I was eating peanut butter out of the jar because I'd forgotten to make lunch. Catherine asked me in the interview why I'd left my previous firm. I told her the truth, the whole of it, without self-pity, just the facts. Husband died, sold the house, relocated, starting over. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "My sister did something similar after her divorce. She's now the CFO of a healthcare company in Denver." She said it like it was relevant, like she was telling me something. She offered me the job at the end of the call. I sat on my kitchen floor after I hung up and cried for about 4 minutes, which was all the time I had before Josie woke up. Then I got up and started figuring out childcare. I want to be honest about the years that followed, because there's a version of this story that flattens them into a montage. Hard work, sacrifice, slow success. And that version isn't wrong exactly, but it leaves out what it actually felt like. It felt like being tired in a way that didn't have a bottom. Not depressed, not defeated, just continuously, structurally tired. The kind of tired where you fall asleep during Josie's bedtime stories and she has to shake you awake. The kind where you become very, very good at calculating exactly how much sleep you can lose before you stop being functional. There was a year when I ate mostly frozen meals and called it meal prep to make myself feel better. There was a year when Josie's preschool called me about a behavioral thing and I sat in the director's office and thought, "I'm doing this wrong. I'm doing all of this wrong," and then drove back to work and stayed until 8 because a client had a quarterly review and I was the lead. There was also the year Josie started reading chapter books and would come sit next to me while I worked late, reading in the lamplight, not asking for anything, just being nearby. There was the year she made me a card for Mother's Day that said "Best Mom in the whole Milky Way." I checked, in her careful 2nd-grade handwriting. There was a Tuesday evening when we made tacos together and she was maybe 9 years old and she told me about a kid at school who was being excluded from lunch groups and I listened and I thought, she has good instincts, this kid. She's gonna be okay. That was the other thing the years felt like. I worked hard at Catherine's firm. I became good at the work, genuinely good, the kind of good that comes from caring about it and from having a brain that finds systems satisfying. I made partner in 7 years, which was faster than anyone had before. I started building a reputation in the Pacific Northwest financial community for being meticulous and honest and difficult to rattle. Clients liked me because I told them the truth without drama and I delivered what I promised. My name started showing up in places, industry publications, a panel at a financial conference in San Francisco where I spoke about risk assessment and a journalist from a business outlet asked for a follow-up interview. I didn't think about Gordon and Marguerite very often. When I did, it was brief. A flash of the rain on the kitchen window, the coffee mug with Thomas's name, the word space, and then I moved on. I didn't hate them, I just didn't have room for it. I had Josie. I had the work. I had a life that was mine. Josie was 15 when she found a photo of Thomas in a box I kept in the top of my closet. I hadn't hidden it from her. She'd always known her father had died before she was born, had seen pictures, knew the basic shape of it. I didn't want her to carry it as a wound, so I'd tried to be matter of fact. He was wonderful. He loved people. He would have loved you so much. Here's what he was like. She came downstairs with the photo in her hand. It was one from early in our relationship, Thomas and me at the Oregon coast, both of us squinting into the sun and laughing about something I couldn't remember anymore. She said, "You look really happy here." I said, "We were." She sat down at the kitchen island and looked at the photo for a while. Then she said, "Do I have grandparents on his side? Like, are they alive?" I told her yes. I told her the simplified version of what had happened, that after her father died, his parents and I had grown apart, that it was a painful time for everyone, that we hadn't stayed in contact. She nodded slowly, the way she did when she was deciding how much to push on something. Then she said, "Do they know about me?" I said I didn't know. I'd never told them. She didn't say anything else about it that day. But I saw her thinking. I was 41 when I left Catherine's firm to take a position I'd been quietly working toward for 3 years, managing director of Pacific Northwest operations at one of the largest financial institutions in the country. It was a significant role. It came with a team of 60 people, a level of public visibility I hadn't had before, and a salary that, if you'd told my 26-year-old self, sitting in a Safeway parking lot in Portland, she would not have believed. The announcement ran in the business section of the Seattle Times. It ran in a regional financial publication. It was covered in a brief item by a national outlet that does short profiles on women in senior financial leadership. I didn't think much about who might read it. The email came on a Wednesday, 11 months after I started the new role. It was from Gordon. He'd found me, he said through the articles. He said he and Marguerite had thought about reaching out for a long time. He said he wanted me to know that they thought of Thomas often and that they had come to understand they had handled his death badly, that they had been grief-stricken and had directed it wrongly. He said he hoped I was well. He said he had heard, through some mutual acquaintance they'd maintained in Portland, that Thomas and I had a daughter. He asked if there was any chance of meeting her. I sat with that email for 3 days. I read it probably 15 times. I analyzed it the way I analyzed financial documents, looking for the actual content underneath the language, what was real and what was constructed. There was real grief in it, I thought. There was also 15 years of silence that he hadn't fully addressed. There was the word badly, doing a lot of work in place of an actual accounting of what he'd done. I talked to Josie about it. She was 21 by then, a junior at the University of Washington, studying environmental science, home for fall break. I showed her the email. I didn't tell her what to think. She read it twice. Then she said, "What do you want to do?" I said I wasn't sure. She said, "I think I'd like to meet them, but I want to know what you need first." I thought about that for a long time. What I needed. It was a question I hadn't been asked by many people. I wrote back to Gordon. I said I'd received his email. I said Josie was aware of him and had expressed interest in meeting her father's family. I said that before that happened, I thought there were things that needed to be said directly, not in email, and I asked if he and Marguerite would be willing to meet with me first, alone, without Josie present. He wrote back within the hour. He said yes. We met at a restaurant in Portland because that felt neutral, their city but not their territory. I drove down on a Saturday morning in November through the rain that Portland does so well, the kind that's not dramatic but just permanent, a condition of existence. Gordon was 73 and looked it. Marguerite was beside him, thinner than I remembered, with the particular careful composure of someone holding something together by willpower. They were already seated when I arrived. Gordon stood when he saw me. He looked uncertain in a way he never had before. I sat down. I ordered coffee. I didn't make small talk. I said, "I've thought about what I want from this conversation, and I think what I want is honesty. Not an apology necessarily, just the truth." Gordon nodded. I said, "You asked me to leave my husband's house 11 days after he died. You called it giving the family space. What it was actually was telling me that I wasn't family. And I want you to say that, not to apologize for it, just to acknowledge that that's what happened." There was a long silence. Marguerite made a small sound. Not words, just a sound. Gordon said, "Yes. That's what happened, and we were wrong." He said it plainly. No elaboration, no contextualization, no pivot to how much they've been suffering. Just, that's what happened, and we were wrong. I'd been preparing for a longer fight. I sat there for a moment and recalibrated. I said, "I was pregnant when you asked me to leave. I didn't tell you because I didn't trust you with it. I had Josie alone in Seattle without any family around. She grew up not knowing any of you, and that's a loss she'll have to decide how she feels about herself." Marguerite was crying quietly. Not performing it, just crying. I said, "I'm not here to punish you. I'm here because Josie wants to know her father's family, and I won't take that from her. But I need you to understand what you took from her first, even if you didn't know you were doing it." Gordon had his hands flat on the table. He didn't look away. He said, "We understand." He said, "We are sorry. We are deeply, genuinely sorry. Not for Thomas dying. We know that wasn't something anyone chose. But for how we treated you and for all the years that happened because of it." I looked at him for a long moment. At this man who had once laid out his terms in a rain-gray kitchen like I was a liability to be managed. He looked diminished now, in the way grief and time diminish people, and I felt something that surprised me. Not warmth exactly. Not yet, but something adjacent to it. Something that was at least not cold. I said, "Thank you. That's what I needed to hear." Josie met them 2 weeks later at a coffee shop in the Pearl District that she'd picked herself because she wanted to choose the ground. I watched from a table near the window as she walked in and Gordon stood up. He looked at her the way people look at someone they've been imagining for years, finally made real. And I saw it happen. That involuntary thing, recognition. She had Thomas's eyes, exactly. The same specific shade of gray-green. The same way they went a little soft around the edges when she smiled. Marguerite reached out and took Josie's hand in both of hers and said something I couldn't hear. Josie sat down. She ordered a lavender latte. She had a list of questions she'd written in her notebook, which she told me about afterward. Questions about Thomas as a kid, what he'd been afraid of, what had made him laugh, the 1,000 things I couldn't tell her because I'd only known him for 2 years. She said she went through most of the list. She said Gordon talked for almost an hour about Thomas's childhood, and she had to keep stopping herself from crying in a public place. She texted me from the parking lot after, "I'm glad I did that. Are you okay?" I wrote back, "Yes, tell me everything." I'm not going to say it resolved cleanly because it didn't. Families that fracture the way ours did don't become whole again just because everyone decides to try. Gordon and Marguerite and I aren't close. We don't have dinner together. There are 15 years of absence between us, and those years aren't nothing. But Josie has a relationship with them now. She calls Marguerite occasionally, drives down to Portland a few times a year. She knows Thomas's childhood home, the neighborhood where he grew up, the high school where he played baseball. She has stories about her father that didn't come from me. That matters. I decided a long time ago to let it matter. Last spring, I was asked to give the commencement address at the University of Oregon, my alma mater, where I'd sat in intro finance classes barely 2 decades ago thinking I was going to work in corporate banking and marry someone nice and have a very normal, medium life. I almost turned it down. I'm not a public speaker by nature. I'm a behind-the-scenes person. I live in data and structure and things that can be measured. Josie said, "Mom, you have to do it." So I did it. I stood at a podium in front of 4,000 people and I talked about the math of starting over. Not in a sentimental way, but practically. That the actual number of variables you need to solve for is always smaller than it looks when you're in the parking lot at midnight trying not to come apart. That the next right thing, specifically, is almost always knowable. That you don't have to see the whole path. You just have to be willing to take the next step in the rain. I wore the blazer I'd bought from my first interview at Catherine's firm, which still fit because I am stubborn about things like that. Afterward, in the reception line, a young woman came up to me, maybe 23, 24, and said she'd lost her mom the year before and she'd almost deferred admission because she hadn't been sure she could do it. She said the part about the math had helped her. She looked like she was holding herself together with both hands. I told her she was already doing it. I told her that was the whole thing, really. Just keep doing it. She thanked me, and I watched her walk away into the Oregon sunlight. And I thought about a parking lot in Portland in November, and a notepad from Powell's, and Thomas's name in permanent marker on a coffee mug. And the very particular feeling of writing a list when you have no idea if any of it is going to work. It worked. Not all at once, not without cost. But it worked. Josie was waiting for me at the edge of the lawn with iced coffee and a look on her face that was half proud and half embarrassed, which is exactly the right way to look when your mother gives a speech in front of your entire school. She handed me the coffee and said, "You did good, Mom. That was enough. That has always been enough." I've thought a lot about what actually happened in that kitchen in Portland. Not the drama of it, not the injustice of it, but the mechanics. Gordon sat down across from me and made a calculation. He looked at a 26-year-old woman with no savings, a dead husband, and no family nearby, and he decided she was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be considered. And in a narrow, transactional sense, he wasn't wrong about the math. I was vulnerable. I had very little. He had leverage and he used it. What he miscalculated was what I would do next. That's the thing about moments like that one. They feel like endings when they're happening. You're standing in the rain with a suitcase, or sitting in a hospital hallway, or parked outside a grocery store at midnight trying to hold yourself together, and it genuinely feels like the last page of something. But it isn't. It's the first page of something else entirely, and the story that comes after depends almost completely on what you decide to do with the next 24 hours. And then the next, and then the next, and then the next after that. I didn't become who I became because I was exceptional. I want to be clear about that. I became who I became because I kept making the next decision. Pay the electric bill. Call the lawyer. Apply for the job. Find the childcare. Show up. Do the work. Come home and make tacos with your daughter and listen to her talk about the kid at school who eats lunch alone. Be present for it. Don't let the exhaustion convince you that none of it matters. Josie is the best thing I have ever done, and I almost didn't have her at all. Not because of Gordon, but because I was so frightened in those early weeks that I genuinely wasn't sure I was capable of doing it alone. The fear was real. What I learned, slowly and not gracefully, is that capability isn't something you discover before you start. It's something you build by starting anyway, terrified, and seeing what happens. Gordon and Marguerite eventually found their way to accountability. Not because they were punished, not because anything dramatic forced their hand, but because time has a way of clarifying the cost of your choices. They spent 15 years without their son's child. They saw a name in a business section and understood, finally, what that silence had cost them. That's not karma in any mystical sense. That's just consequence, the ordinary arithmetic consequence of having treated someone as disposable and then living long enough to see what she built without you. I don't carry what happened to me as a wound anymore. I carried it for a while. It's heavy, a thing like that, and it takes a long time to figure out how to set it down without losing the lessons it taught you. The lesson it taught me was this: your circumstances are not your ceiling. Someone else's cruelty is not a verdict on your worth. And the people who dismiss you when you have nothing are not the ones who get to define what you become. Josie texted me last week a photo of herself at a field site in eastern Washington. Muddy boots, big grin, holding a soil sample like it was something precious. She's going to be good at her work. She's going to be the kind of person who pays attention, who shows up, who doesn't quit when things are hard, because she watched someone do that her entire childhood, up close, in real time. That's the inheritance I was able to give her. It turned out to be enough?